Biden administration made an announcement about the movement of troops into Romania so that they'll be at the disposal of NATO in order to assure our NATO allies of our commitment to their defense. So today we gather as Europe stands on the precipice of war. The Kremlin has amassed an enormous array of troops and heavy weaponry at Ukraine's doorstep, demanding its submission. The Kremlin's threat menaces not only Ukraine, our partners in Georgia, in the wider region, but also the long-cherished dream and long-standing bipartisan U.S. policy to work towards a Europe whole and free. The United States, Ukraine, and Europe speak with one voice. We are united and we are resolute. Although our shared enterprise is one of peace, the United States and our allies will not back down in the face of Kremlin's aggression.
We are confronted with this possibility of the largest land invasion in Europe since World War II. President Putin amassing over 100,000 troops, I guess 170,000 they're estimating now, and military equipment on the border of Ukraine. Let me be very clear. The Kremlin's rhetoric about Ukraine presenting a security threat to Russia is nothing more than a lie being used to force its own will on an independent European state. It's almost comical to think that when you bring 170,000 troops and all other type of military equipment to the borders of a country, that you're saying that that country is a security threat to Russia. It's absurd. Let's not forget that Putin has been waging a war on Ukraine and Crimea in the Donbass since 2014, the year of the Revolution of Dignity, when Ukrainians took to the streets in favor of European integration over submission to Moscow. Really a heroic period of time when people risked their lives for democracy, many of whom lost their lives, many of whom were injured, but they knew they wanted to be free, and they put it on the line, and they succeeded. The Kremlin has time and again used Ukraine as a testing ground for operations, be it cyber attacks, weaponization of energy, or proxy wars that are later used against others, including the United States. This is as much about Europe and the free world as it is about Ukraine. It is my hope this Kremlin-manufactured crisis can be resolved through diplomacy. A failure to do so will lead to the unnecessary loss of lives on both sides of this conflict. The Russians don't want to see their children come home in body bags, nor do the Ukrainians. Putin might not care, but most Russian people don't want to see it, and certainly the parents of the soldiers don't want to see it. He won't stop at Ukraine. He wants what Peter the Great had. He wants what the Soviet Union used to be.
The Helsinki Commission is uniquely positioned for this conversation. After all, the Commission is tasked with monitoring the commitments made under the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, which served as a common foundation for acceptable behavior of European states and has promoted peace and security and prosperity. And I might mention that the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 was signed by the leadership of every member country, including the leadership of Russia at the time. They voluntarily entered into this agreement, and they should be bound by it. Putin's Russia had violated every single precept of the Helsinki Final Act. Georgia in 2008 invaded illegally under a pretext invented by the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Putin is now treading underfoot the principles at the heart of the Commission's work, principles agreed to by Mr. Putin's predecessors in Moscow. My colleagues, as you know, I recently traveled to Ukraine with a bipartisan group of senators, 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. Based on what I heard there, I have no doubt the Ukrainians will fight fiercely to defend their sovereignty and their boundaries. We must do everything we can to deter the dictator Putin by making plain to him the costs of his brazen assault on an OSCE member country. Let me close by stressing 2 things. Nobody wants to see an escalation of the Ukrainian conflict. If it is escalated, it is because Mr. Putin has brought 100,000 troops in to the edge of the eastern part of Ukraine. It is because he has moved elite Russian troops from the far eastern parts of Russia to the border of Ukraine in Belarus.
It's never been more urgent to understand the threats to Ukraine, not only militarily, but on the humanitarian level. Conflict breaking out between these 2 nations would result in a needless and horrific loss of Russian and Ukrainian life. Russian families would suffer again. The world must not repeat the consequences of a European cross-border invasion as occurred in 1939, ultimately resulting in 27 million dead in the Soviet Union, 8 million dead in Germany, and the genocide of over 6 million Jews. Putin's tyrannical decisions continue to damage the reputations of the talented people of Russia. There should be no repetition of the 1932 Red Famine, where Stalin starved 4 million Ukrainians, along with 1 million in Kazakhstan and the Volga region.
Thank you so much. The current phase of this crisis in Ukraine has been manufactured by Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. And I think for all of us, it's quite difficult to identify a specific trigger for the decision to build up forces to such an extent on the borders close to Ukraine, or to suddenly escalate events in December of last year. In many respects, the timing seems driven more by Vladimir Putin's own political predilections and perceptions of developments, rather than by events on the ground in Ukraine or in the contested Donbass region. So in terms of understanding the current context for the crisis, there are several factors at play for Moscow and Putin I think are relevant for us to consider during this hearing. First of all, Moscow has actually successfully reasserted itself as the dominant political force and security provider in Eurasia. In contrast with Ukraine currently, the other former Soviet states have now either been pressured into closer political and security relations with Moscow or into a more neutral, marginal international status. Just as a couple of examples, in Georgia, 14 years after Russia's invasion, the current government is treading very carefully with Russia. Georgia's former president, Mikhail Saakashvili, who was a perennial thorn in Moscow's side, now sits in jail in Tbilisi. Russian officials and commentators frequently use Saakashvili and his fate as a cautionary tale for the rest of the region, including Ukraine. In summer 2020, in Armenia, President Nikol Pashinyan, another leader who's fallen out of favour with Moscow, saw his domestic position and former foreign policy autonomy crushed by the war with Azerbaijan. Given the fact that Russia and Armenia have a long-standing defence pact and Russian forces are permanently based in Armenia, Azerbaijan's military assault to retake territory occupied by Armenia for the last 3 decades was unlikely to have been feasible without a green light from Moscow. And Russia has now exploited the 2020 war to introduce its military forces into Nagorno-Karabakh, sidelining the OSCE Minsk group. Elsewhere, Belarusian strongman Alexander Lukashenko has been forced back into the fold after a disastrous presidential election on his part. And in January 2022, so just in the last month, Russia and its regional security alliance, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, were of course called in to quash protests and to quell a political power struggle in Kazakhstan. This was the first time that the CSTO was deployed on the territory of a member country. So Russia feels emboldened by all of these developments in Eurasia. From Russia's perspective, the United States played no significant role in addressing these upheavals. And the United States, again from Russia's perspective, seems grievously weakened at home and abroad. For Vladimir Putin, again this is his view, America's political disarray mirrors Russia's predicament immediately after the dissolution of the USSR and offers a rare opportunity. If the United States really is in a state of collapse at home and in retreat abroad, as Putin and the Kremlin assesses, then, in Putin's view again, perhaps Russia can overturn the last 30 years of American dominance in European security and also constrain Ukraine's independence. If we look at Europe, not just at Eurasia, Moscow now sees ample opportunity to take advantage of developments there. The reverberations from Brexit, Poland and Hungary's disputes with the EU. Of course, we've just seen Viktor Orban in Moscow meeting with Vladimir Putin directly. The legacy of 4 years of rifts between the United States and its European allies, the departure of long-serving German Chancellor Angela Merkel from the political scene, preparations for presidential elections in France, and Washington's precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan have exacerbated frictions and fractures in NATO and the EU that Russia thinks it can exploit. And again, from Russia's perspective, there's an opportunity because European military spending and operational readiness have declined over the last decades relative to the United States and Russia. And despite an uptick in spending and deployment since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, 2 of our most significant European military partners, the UK and France, are increasingly at loggerheads, while our other major partner, Turkey, is preoccupied with Syria and the Middle East. Again, from Russia's perspective, Europe's punitive financial tools, along with the political will to deploy them, have been weakened. Moscow has effectively moved over the past decade, and especially since its annexation of Crimea in 2014, to shore up the Russian economy against Western sanctions, including through paying off state debts, making strategic direct investments in companies across Europe in critical infrastructure, energy and metallurgy, and also by deepening ties with the private sectors of key European countries, even at the height of this crisis, to try to offset any retaliatory economic actions that we might take. Putin and the Kremlin clearly believe that European and American investors will serve as Russian allies and advocates for limited sanctions, and that they will push for a speedy reconciliation with Russia, limiting our government's capacity for confrontation. Putin has also taken Russia's ambitions and positions during this crisis well beyond Eurasia and Europe. Russia is consolidating relationships with US adversaries with the blatantly signalled goal of challenging America's global posture. We've seen this with recent visits to Iran by Putin, and of course we're soon going to be seeing Vladimir Putin sitting alongside President Xi at the opening of the Beijing Olympics. And there have been many other instances where Putin has clearly moved out into other theatres to signal that Russia means business there as well. Putin's been quite explicit about these moves, as well as about the ideas of deploying new nuclear weapon systems to parts of territory closer to Europe, or perhaps even to the Caribbean, under some recent commentary out of Moscow. And this whole goal here seems to be to undermine the current international order, or at least to show an intent to do so, as a gambit to get the United States to the negotiating table. As members of the Commission have already stated, Russia has long sought a commitment from the United States, NATO and the European Union that it will have a clearly defined role in post-Cold War European security institutions and also decision-making power whenever developments or events run counter to its interests. Putin's very mindful of 2024, not just when we have our presidential election, but also when he must theoretically, as well as in practice, submit himself for re-election at home to then gain the presidency for perhaps another 6 to even 12 years, depending on how many terms he sees before him at this particular juncture. So in many respects, time is of the essence for Putin. He would like to achieve a resolution of these issues before 2024. And right now, his public opinion ratings are not what they used to be. The last time Putin's popular approval fell significantly was just before the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. At that juncture, annexation proved universally popular in Russia, and Putin may hope for a similar boost ahead of the Russian presidential elections by showing the Russian people that he can take decisive action against Ukraine, NATO and the United States. In the meantime, at home, Putin has done a very good job in Russia of making the United States and NATO look like the aggressors in the perpetration of this crisis. Abroad, he's also bent on convincing the rest of the world that Ukraine is either an internal matter for Russia to resolve or the object of a Cold War-style dust-up with the United States. It's Putin that's trying to depict this as a proxy war, like Korea and Vietnam were in the Cold War. But however, in recent Russian polling, half of Russians believe that the United States and NATO were to blame for the crisis, and only a tiny fraction thought that Russia itself was to blame. But across the border in Ukraine, in stark contrast, more than 70% of Ukrainians now view Russia as a hostile state, which has increased from 60% in spring of 2021. And I would just offer to the Commission, and again, I'd be very interested to hear what Lieutenant General Hodges and Ambassador Taylor have to say about this after their recent visit to Ukraine, that this latter point about Ukrainian attitudes could prove very problematic for Putin. The Russian president knows history inside out, Russian history that is, but he also has his very own version of it that isn't always shared, not only by us, but also by Ukrainians. The Kremlin and Putin have long deployed Russian values and Russian history as weapons in their conduct of information warfare, especially when it comes to Ukraine. And Putin has, of course, asserted that Russia and Ukraine are historically, culturally, linguistically, and inextricably tied together. He posits that they have only been separated by an accident of history, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in this narrative context for Putin, this is why we're in this crisis. The mere prospect of any kind of formal relationship between Ukraine and NATO, or between Ukraine and the EU, or Ukraine and the United States, is considered a direct threat to Russia, and also to Putin personally, because every aspect of the Ukraine conflict has been made personal for him. He's talked repeatedly about his own connections to Ukraine and to Crimea, and every move has so far been on his timetable, and every Russian official and commentator has stressed that the ultimate decision-making in Ukraine is up to Vladimir Putin, as well as the small group of people in his inner circle who share his own views. But in acting against Ukraine, Putin and Russia look set to create an eternal enemy out of this neighbouring country, as well as destabilising European and global affairs for years to come, especially if Ukrainian views that Russia is engaged in hostile acts are really as high as they seem to be in the polls.
President Zelensky is not confused about the threat. He knows it is very real and that the survival of his government and of his country are at stake. He differs with the United States government as to the scale of what a new Russian offensive will look like, but he has no illusions about the threat. President Zelensky's aim is to grow the size of his armed forces by 100,000 soldiers over the next 3 years, and for that, he needs financial resources. He is not asking for any soldiers from any nation. He only asks for the financial resources to build his own army. The threat from Russia is real, and it is growing. While a new Russian offensive is not imminent, I fear it is increasingly likely. There is no sign of de-escalation. President Putin appears overconfident. He is applying maximum pressure on the West in this self-manufactured crisis in hopes that Ukraine and or NATO will eventually make concessions. What is at stake? As German Foreign Minister Baerbock recently stated, it is the entire European peace order. Stability and security in the transatlantic area are endangered if Putin can enlarge Russia's territorial will without regard for international law, existing treaties, and borders. A failure of deterrence would further open the door to the Russian way of war with cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, aggression in the air and maritime domains, targeted assassinations, and the weaponization of Russian-controlled energy resources. A new influx of potentially tens of thousands of refugees into Western Europe would have destabilizing effects across Europe, which is one of the Kremlin's intended outcomes of such an attack. I do not believe that a large-scale attack towards Kyiv is likely, as it would generate too many Russian casualties, and it's not actually necessary for them to achieve their strategic aim. Instead, I anticipate that a new offensive will be a continuation of what they are already doing. A new offensive is more likely to be a series of rolling, limited, objective operations to, number one, demonstrate that the Kremlin is not deterred by NATO, 2, to further weaken the government of Ukraine, and 3, to frustrate Western decision-makers with actions below some perceived threshold of violence that might make going forward with the most severe sanctions more difficult.
The United States and the rest of NATO
and Ukraine face a challenge from the Russian Federation that threatens stability and security in Europe and the world. If President Putin decides to invade Ukraine, it will drastically escalate a war that has already killed 14,000 Ukrainians and will result in the deaths of tens of thousands more, thousands of Russian soldiers. As President Putin considers his options, he should remember that in addition to the crippling cost of sanctions and heavy losses on the battlefield, attacking and killing civilians is a war crime. As you have heard from Dr. Hill and General Hodges, Mr. Putin is making demands that he knows the United States and the rest of NATO and Ukraine will never agree to. President Zelensky and President Biden have firmly rejected those demands. Presidents Zelensky and Biden are not backing down in the face of Putin's saber rattling. They are not compromising principle, and they are not blinking. Mr. Chairman, I believe President Putin will blink. I think Presidents Biden and Zelensky are staring him down successfully. Putin appears for now to be seeking negotiations. The strong measures taken by Ukraine, NATO, and the United States appear to have deterred an invasion, at least for now. However, until Mr. Putin withdraws the large military force from Ukraine's borders and sends it back to normal duty stations, we should continue to take the strong steps that seem to have deterred an invasion so far. Mr. Putin seems to be coming around to the conclusion that negotiations are a better option than invading. The United States, NATO, Ukraine, and the rest of Europe are ready to sit at the negotiating tables to discuss ways to improve the security of NATO, Russia, and Europe. Placement of nuclear missiles, size and location of military exercises, confidence building measures, these can all be discussed. Some of these issues have already been the subject of negotiations between the United States and Russia since last summer. What is not subject to negotiation is the sovereignty of any nation, including and especially Ukraine. The United States, its allies, and Ukraine have been rock solid on this principle. Sticking to that firm stance, backed by credible threats of heavy military and financial costs, seems to have worked. Why do I think Mr. Putin has decided not to invade for now? His statements yesterday suggest that he wants to negotiate. He has complained about, but has not rejected, the responses from the United States and NATO to his demands. His officials have indicated that they are still studying the responses, that further exchanges of papers and further conversations can happen. Mr. Lavrov has asked all 57 nations of the OSCE to answer a vague question about the indivisibility of security. The negotiations in the Normandy format among Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France have restarted. The strong united stand of Ukraine, Europe, and the United States seems to have deterred an invasion for now. They should continue until all Russian forces are back in their peacetime posts. Mr. Chairman, you and members of this commission today have explained the importance of abiding by the principles of sovereignty that have kept Europe free of major wars for 69 years, until Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. Until Russia recommits to those principles and accepts Ukrainian sovereignty and withdraws from its territory, Europe and the world will not be secure. Ukraine matters for another reason. Even though it's an old civilization and culture, centuries older than Russia, by the way, it is a young democracy of 45 million people, the vast majority of whom seek nothing more than the ability to live a normal life as a normal European country, able to choose their leaders, able to choose their trading partners, able to choose their security alliances, able to choose their political partners. They find themselves on the front line of a war they didn't start. They are fighting Russia on our behalf. Like American soldiers and military who fight on behalf of all American citizens, Ukraine is fighting Russia on behalf of Europe and the United States. It is the front line of the battle between democracy and autocracy. We should support them. With that support, they will prevail. Putin will lose.
I think from Putin's perspective, he already has had something of a win because he's got our undivided attention. And part of the exercise was clearly to get us to focus on him. Putin and others around him have been very frustrated that from their perspective, they haven't been able to have a big sit-down with the United States in particular, to in effect go over and perhaps even have a redo of the European security arrangement since the end of the Cold War. They've made it very clear that the current arrangement for the OSCE is not sufficient because, of course, that gives equal standing to every member of the Organisation of Security and Cooperation in Europe, no matter the size of the country or, the significance of their military. And they've been looking for decision-making or veto power. If we look back to 2008, when Vladimir Putin was at that point sort of standing behind the shoulders of President Medvedev, Putin was, of course, the Prime Minister and had stepped aside for a period before coming back again. Dmitry Medvedev made a visit to Berlin in the early part of 2008 and made a pitch, an open request then for a rethinking and a revision and refurbishment of European security arrangements. From the Russians' perspective, we didn't pick this up because, in effect, what they were looking for was almost an overturning of the Helsinki Final Act and of the OSCE, and looking for something for more along the format that we'd seen in earlier centuries, more of a concert of Europe of the big powers, essentially the US and Russia sitting down and resolving the deposition and the forces, as well as the various institutional arrangements of Europe. So Putin's still looking for that. So I think what Ambassador Taylor was saying in Putin saying that they're still considering, they're still reviewing this strange, let's ask a country a kind of a question about the indivisibility of security to all of the member states of the OSCE is very telling. They're kind of looking for something here that Putin will be able to say, look, I got everyone's attention. I've got everyone to resolve this question or address this question of security. I've got everyone to the negotiating table. I don't suspect that it'll be sufficient to have just the responses from all the 50-plus members. Putin will want to be seen to be sitting down with President Biden in some fashion, just like he already did in Geneva and again during the various telephone or telecommunication sessions, just like the set pieces that they've had at NATO and in other settings. But Putin is looking for something to show that his interests have been addressed in some fashion. If, however, he feels that they have not, and I think this is where Ambassador Taylor and Lieutenant General Hodges have put their finger on, he will continue to keep escalating. And that's where we might see some steps forward, perhaps along the lines that Lieutenant General Hodges has laid out. So I think for us right now, it's all in the art of the diplomacy, and in a way that we can be able to show to Putin that the incredible costs that he's incurred, because it hasn't been cost-free in moving all these troops from the Russian Far East. I mean, this is logistically a major effort. These costs have paid off in some way.
I agree with Dr. Hill. That is, he has been deterred so far. It has been expensive for him. And the right question is the one you asked, Ms. Cohen, and that is, what did he get for this? Or what can he get for this? How can he back down, not invade Ukraine, and still say to the Russian people that he got what he wanted? Well, he clearly is not going to get one of the things, indeed the core things that he says he wants, and that is infringement on Ukrainian sovereignty and the closing of NATO's open door. He's not going to get that. It's very clear. However, as Dr. Hill just said, he's going to get an opportunity to negotiate with President Biden, with NATO, with the rest of Europe in the OSCE, and he will be able to say exactly as Dr. Hill just said, look, I've been complaining about the fact that the West has not taken my security concerns seriously. They haven't taken into account my concerns. Well, I've finally gotten them to do that, he can say to the Russian people. And they're sitting down with me and having this conversation. And Mr. Chairman, I think that's okay. Fine for him to say that. He didn't get the principle, he didn't get us to violate the principle of sovereignty. He didn't get to close NATO's open door. He got to sit down and talk. That's fine. He can convince the Russian people that that's a win.
Of course, President Putin had a seat with all the leaders of the world when he used to be a part of the G8, but it's now the G7, and he lost his seat because of his behavior and illegal conduct. Has he won? At huge risk, I'm going to slightly disagree with Dr. Hill, who I've respected for years. What has he achieved? NATO is more vigorous today than it has probably been in probably the last 20 to 25 years. There are other nations in the queue to join NATO. Finland and Sweden are openly talking about it's their right to decide whether or not they want to join NATO. Unthinkable even just a couple of years ago. Sweden has put troops back on Gotland Island in the Baltic Sea. There are very bright lights now shining on the dirty money in London real estate belonging to various oligarchs in Russia. And more nations now are increasingly energy independent and looking for ways to get themselves off of dependence on Russian gas. I'm not sure he is quite the genius that he is sometimes made out to be. And of course, the key is how long can he sustain what he's doing? I spoke with the Ukrainian officer just the other day. He said indefinitely, because, of course, President Putin doesn't have to answer to the Duma the way American president would have to answer to the United States Congress. He doesn't have to worry about those things. I'm not sure he can. I believe he can sustain it for a long time. I'm just not sure how much longer.
Thank you, General. One of the questions I've got, you say that he may be losing some of his popularity in Russia. What difference does it make?
Well, as strange as it may seem, Putin cares very much because he is drawing all of his legitimacy from himself alone in the Constitution. He's got no political party. And as we've already, made very clear, that the Russian Duma, the parliament, doesn't, matter quite so much. What he's always had is his ratings, because it's also a signal to all the people around him who might actually be quite interested in his job over the longer term. Putin's been able to actually say to, a lot of younger guys who might say, well, hang on, are you really going to stay out till 2036 as president? By that time, you're going to be 84 years old. You'll have been in, power in Russia longer than any other contemporary modern leader. And, we think that one of the reasons that he pushed out the possibility of staying for an extra 2 terms from 2024, when was supposed to be his actual expiration date for the current presidency, was that he was worried that not only would he be a lame duck, but the people would be manoeuvring around him, trying to displace him or maybe make an early bid even for the presidency if they were selected as one of the potentials as a replacement. And so if he can keep pointing to major support in the ratings in polls, then that helps to boost his legitimacy and his own influence inside that tight circle around him. So it is actually more important than it seems. I mean, right now, of course, his ratings, even in the current Russian polls, don't look that low from our perspective. I mean, from most American members of Congress or presidents, these would look like great ratings. But when you've pushed them into stratospheric levels, into the upper 80%, after the annexation of Crimea, the only place really to go is down. And so, a lot of the way that he handles this, I mean, I agree with Lieutenant General Hodges. From our perspective, he's actually lost quite a lot. I think the important thing is for him to have won. I think that's kind of what we're both trying to say here. We have to be able to kind of allow him to have the space at home for declaring a win to give an off-ramp. Because he has to be able to spin it. I mean, he doesn't have the media breathing down his neck, but he does have the people around him that he has to demonstrate strength and infallibility to. I mean, he may not appear to be the genius to us that he wants to be, but he has to be at home because his own position, in a way, and his support depends on that.
You may have said it as well. Ambassador Taylor said it. He said that we've already been successful in the way we have dealt with him because we've deterred him. Well, when you say we've deterred him, I guess you're saying that he hasn't invaded?
Yeah, for now. I mean, that's the thing.
So your thought is he would have invaded?
Well,
and if he would have invaded, why do you think he won't invade?
Right, well, he still could. So let's just be very, very clear about this. So I think Ambassador Taylor was very careful for now because, we were, in fact, anticipating some action. Absolutely. We keep saying it's imminent because it really could happen at every time. And if we go back, and I think this is where Ambassador Taylor and Lieutenant General Hodges could come in on this as well. If we look back to what happened in 2014, certainly the Russian intent was to push much further than the Donbass region, to push down to the areas around the Sea of Azov, port cities like Mariupol, to go to Kherson, which is further beyond the Crimean Peninsula, maybe as far as Odessa, to try to consolidate a hold over various proxy forces that would cut Ukraine off from the sea and also link up with Crimea. Very forceful action by the United States together with its allies, especially after the downing of the Malaysian airlines in 2014. I think we can make a very strong case that it helped to stop Russia and from the tracks, deter them somewhat and force them to pull back. Also because there was a strong response from the Ukrainian people in opposition to this. And I think what we've seen right now, for now, and I think it's very important to listen to what General Hodges and Ambassador Taylor said about keeping up this pressure and this unity, and the unity that you've all displayed, honestly, here in Congress in a bipartisan fashion, that might also not have factored into Putin's calculations, to be frank. I think in showing that we are actually determined to counter this, it's given him some pause.
General Hodges, let me ask you this. What type of military powers does Ukraine have to stop a Soviet invasion? What does Ukraine have to respond, and how long could they resist an invasion?
Well, sir, the Ukrainian armed forces, of course, are significantly improved from 2014. They're not small. I mean, we're talking about 200,000 regular soldiers plus reservists. And candidly, I am not terribly concerned about there being 50, 70,000 Russian troops along the northern border. I mean, when you think about the size of Ukraine, I mean, it's twice the size of Germany. And sir, I know you think about 100,000 troops. I mean, that would barely fill up the stadium where the University of Tennessee plays football or the University of Michigan plays football. So that's a lot of people, but when you spread it out, the combat power doesn't look quite as daunting as when you just say the number. They do not have enough forces right now deployed that could capture Kyiv, in my view. I believe that Ukrainian forces are going to fight like hell, and that this will be a real bloody fight for the Russians. Now, they do have advantages, obviously, in their maritime fleet, in their navy, in their air power, It's certainly longer-range systems, and whatever they do, it's going to be led by a massive cyber that will make everything difficult, disinformation that will confuse people and cause panic, and without a doubt, there is going to be sabotage. Already, Ukrainian interior forces have rolled up several different groups of saboteurs coming from Transnistria, Belarus, and from Russia, Chechnya. That's all going to happen. But I don't see this massive assault that's just going to roll over Ukrainian land forces.
One of the big issues seems to be sanctions before they invade, sanctions after they invade. Ambassador Taylor, what do you think is more effective?
Mr. Cohen, I think that the purpose of sanctions, unlike the purpose of movement of military forces, is best done after they move. And let me, if I can do 2 sentences on that, I know you want a short answer. Move military forces before they move, before the invasion comes, in order to demonstrate that this is a serious deterrent. The goal is to deter him from invading Ukraine. And so move those forces, like the administration has decided to do this morning. The sanctions, as Congress knows very well, can go on in a hurry and go off very slowly. We're thinking of Jackson Vanik sanctions that must have taken 20 years to remove. That's not a deterrent if you put those on in advance. It's a deterrent if those serious sanctions are promised and detailed and are credibly coordinated with Europeans so that when he does come across, they go on. But once they're on, then if you do it in advance, they lose their deterrent value.
I was so grateful, Ambassador, that you said you didn't feel like there would be an invasion, because it would be catastrophic for the people of Russia. General Hodges correctly pointed out that it's had an unintended effect of unifying NATO in the EU, and possibly particularly having an effect on Finland and Sweden. But right here in the room today, another consequence is unified Republicans and Democrats to be working together, and lightning's going to strike. I'm really pleased that Mr. Biden has changed course. Just in December, we were planning on $40 million after an invasion. Well, in the meantime, nearly $1 billion of very important defensive material have been provided to the people of Ukraine. And so this needs to be understood. Dr. Hill, how in the world, I know it's state-controlled media, but how is this being kept from the people, highly educated people of Russia? And what can we do to get a message to them that they will be the most victimized by an invasion of Ukraine?
I think this is a really important point, Congressman Wilson. I mean, you've very clearly delineated, all of the countries that are going to be directly affected. I think actually in Slovakia right now, the second largest ethnic group besides Slovaks is not actually Czechs, but is Ukrainians, because of Slovakia's border. I'm sure we were well aware of that. Yeah. And of course, there are Ukrainians all over Europe now, especially over the last several years as Ukrainians have got visa liberalization with Europe. And, more broadly, we could have gone further afield. Obviously, Canada, to our north, has a very large population that has its roots in Ukraine. Not least, I think she's still Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister, a classmate of mine from school as well. So, we have, as you've said, this is not a contained conflict by any means. There's also many other countries around the world, India, Japan, who are watching this very anxiously. The idea of a confrontation that would be depicted, at least from the Russian side, as a proxy war between Russia and the United States over Ukraine. China, we've talked about Taiwan and our concerns, ahead of the Beijing Olympics as well, about how this might reverberate in the Asia-Pacific region. I think this is actually one way in which we need to get this message across to Russia and to the Russian people, is by these other channels. It's not so much that information is being kept out, it's the spin on the information. If you're looking at Russian television, what you see is, of course, is the depiction of the United States and NATO as the aggressors. A lot of the news is really more opinion than it is actually of news. The kind of alternate information is obviously there on the internet for people to see or in their interactions with us, but it also has to be our private sector sending messages. One of the things that I skipped over in my opening remarks, but that's in the fuller testimony that I put into the record, is my really concern about the position of the private sector. So we have many American companies invested in Russia. There's a lot of Russian investment in the United States. But really, President Putin has emphasized investment in Europe and in European countries. Not only have we just seen Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, going and making a huge gas deal in the middle of this crisis for his own domestic purposes. We saw Putin reaching out to heads of Italian business because he sees that Italy might be a weak link here. we have to somehow, within your interactions with your constituents, those who might be investors, particularly from, major, states like Texas, Congressman Veasey, where there's a lot of major interest in the oil and gas sector, figure out ways in which we can pass messages on. This is going to be disastrous for business, not just for international security. It's going to be disastrous at the human level. And all the ties and connections that have been built up in the last 30 years will be jeopardized by this. We have the signaling coming from London right now where a lot of the Russian oligarchs, but a lot of ordinary Russians have now, made their home and made their base there for business. I mean, not everyone in Russia is somehow related to the Kremlin and involved in nefarious dealings. We have students at universities, especially in Europe. All of this is going to be upended, and that's a way of spreading out this kind of information. We won't make much headway, unfortunately, through our own broadcasting into Russia. It'll have to be through our using these connections that Putin uses for his own purposes ourselves to pass on messages.
Dr. Hill, I wanted to talk with you about some of the off-ramp. You've studied Putin. You understand his ego. You know what's acceptable to him, what's not. What, in your opinion, are some acceptable off-ramps that have been offered, and some that you think are just completely out of the question?
Well, I mean, part of the problem, you've mentioned the word ego, is that it has to look like a win for Putin. And I think that that's kind of what Ambassador Taylor and I were trying to sketch out here. If he can say to the Russian people, in this environment in which obviously there's a lot of slant in the media, and obviously the Kremlin can shape that in a major way, that they have used to good effect their military force, that they have, by threatening Europe, they've got our attention, they've got a full and undivided attention, that they've pushed us to the negotiating table. That in itself can certainly buy us some time for some more diplomacy to then craft something that might be a bit more meaningful as an off-ramp, which is going to be tricky, however, because as we've already stated, and as the administration has stated, NATO has stated, we are not going to compromise on the sovereignty of Ukraine. That's not ours to compromise. And we're not going to compromise on NATO's open door policy, because for Finland, Sweden, and other countries that are potentially aspirants for NATO candidacy, that's very important. I mean, members of NATO, other members of the alliance, do not want to see the open door for NATO closed, although they may actually have some hesitancy about Ukraine and Georgia and other former Soviet states that might seek to join. If there is any change, that has to be Ukraine's to decide, not just NATO trying to close that door, even though, of course, it is a consensus organization. So that's not on the agenda right now. But Russia has been pushing for a serious discussion of European security for years, and they made a proposal in 2008 in Berlin when Dmitry Medvedev came there, and it was in the context of the OSCE. So for the members of this commission, this could be something very important to consider about how we might shape and formulate a major discussion about European security architecture that would then include confidence-building measures. I think we've already talked about many of these, as you've suggested. The disposition of forces. We have the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty is now in abeyance, so since 2015 I don't think we've had any kinds of discussions about this. Obviously, Russia has made a big show with its novel nuclear weapons of wanting a debate about the future of nuclear missiles, both tactical and intermediate on European territory. We were on the verge of talking to them about commitments not to actually station missiles or further missiles in Europe. I mean, that was all part of a discussion that we were moving forward that has obviously been put to a halt to right now. So there are many things that we could do, but it will have to be framed from Putin in such a way that he can credibly go back to not just the people around him, but to the Russian public and say, I got a win. And that we might not actually want to give him. So part of that will be dependent on us as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also wanted to ask you as well, with the oligarchs have been mentioned a couple of times in the testimony likewise, and the tremendous amount of money that they've invested in different places in Europe. Can they be used? And I know that, aside from cutting off their money, just if you were to suspend their visas or make it hard for them to travel throughout Europe, is there a way to really put pressure on them and have it get back to Putin and perhaps have him back off through those guys, since they also have money and he's very influenced by money and wealth?
Yeah, I mean, look, you also here in Congress and in the Senate have been discussing various ways of tackling illicit finance. I mean, we had the revelations from the Pandora Papers most recently about all of the offshore zones, including places like South Dakota, which I think was probably a surprise for most people, probably including members of Congress from South Dakota, that were being used as places where shell companies can set themselves up, and those are the kinds of instruments that are used by Russian oligarchs and others, basically to hide money, to safeguard money, but also ultimately, they try to make strategic investments, as I've said already, in companies here in the United States. We have to use the CFIUS process to make sure that that's not being leveraged in any way. There's an awful lot of things that we can do to clean up our own act, to enforce our own regulations. I think here in the US we've been much more forward-leaning on the federal and congressional and Senate level than many of our counterparts have been in Europe. A lot of it has to be done on the state and local government level as well, to be frank. But we are going to have to work with our European allies. The Brits actually are a real weak link in this. And now the British House of Commons is about to do a series of hearings in the next week. Perhaps you could reach out to some of your counterparts on looking specifically at similar legislation to the legislation we already have here in the United States that we passed in the NDAA, for example. They're trying to figure out how they can also close up loopholes, make it more difficult for Russian oligarchs and the Kremlin themselves to use the British legal system as well as the financial system. There's an awful lot of dirty money and illicit finance floating around in London. And then, more broadly in Europe, we have to be working with our European allies, the European Union as well, to figure out how they can put similar processes to CFIUS in place. There's an awful lot that we can do, and I think there's an awful large role for Congress. I mean, we already set the tone, Congress did with the International Magnitsky Bill, for example. So you yourselves, as members of the Congress, can also drive some of the other efforts in our European partner countries.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
What our strategies or tactics differ if we thought Russia was on the brink of some sort of military action, or if we thought that they were really calling the bluff, as it were, of the NATO coalition and the Section 5 provisions. I mean, because after all, I think, Dr. Hill, you have really sort of laid out all of the weak links that we are experiencing. We've got so-called NATO members like Hungary and Turkey that are flaky. We have Germany being concerned about its own fossil fuel resources. France is about to experience an election, and of course there are always concerns there. What our tactics and strategies change were we to focus on really ensuring that this alliance is solid, and even we as the United States have shown some light of day in terms of our resolve, saying, yeah, if it's a small incursion, we'll do this or we'll do that. We're going to send troops, but the troops aren't going to do anything. And so I guess if it's okay to talk tactically about where we should be putting our energy, is that to shore up the NATO alliance, or is it to put those units on the borders? Belarus is right there to be a staging ground. So I just wonder strategically what we ought to focus on. Thank you, Dr. Hill and Lieutenant General.
I think this is really an excellent way of laying this out. We've covered every base there. And, of course, we do have a difference. It would be interesting to hear, how that came out in Ukraine with some of our European allies and partners about, and I think actually some of our Western European partners, have been a bit of skepticism on the part of the French, for example, about whether this is an elaborate bluff. Well, if it is an elaborate bluff, it's also a very expensive bluff on the part of Putin. This is the first time that we've seen forces being moved from the Russian Far East, as was mentioned at the very beginning, certainly since the end of the Cold War, for example, to the borders with Ukraine. And I'd like to get Lieutenant General Hodges to comment on, what we've seen here. My experience also of Putin is that he usually, if he threatens, he usually intends to act in some fashion. And the Russians themselves have threatened this military technical action, so giving themselves a lot of options, notwithstanding what Lieutenant General Hodges has said about the unlikelihood of being able to do a massive full invasion that would take Kiev. There's a lot of options that Putin has laid out for himself there, including, kind of further repetition. This gets to that point about another incursion, which is President Zelensky of Ukraine said there's no such thing as an incursion. Well, it's your territory that's been taken, the kind of salami tactics of one move and then waiting and taking some more moves. There are many things that he can do. Each time, people have thought that Putin was bluffing. Georgia, for example, in 2008, he moved in. In Syria, we weren't sure that they were going to intervene on behalf of Assad, and they did. We've had a firefight between paramilitary forces, again, so they can also use subversion. In Syria in 2018, when members of the Wagner paramilitary group of Russian contract forces fired on our special forces, and we had a whole firefight with the Russians behind the scenes. So we should be very careful about the idea of this being a bluff, but I know that many of our allies are a bit sceptical about what they see is happening. So, in the larger strategic context, which I think my colleagues and I've already laid out, we need to keep this up. We need to keep up our response as if we're taking this absolutely 100% seriously. Call the bluff, as you were, because, in past practice, Putin often hasn't bluffed and has done something. And so to deterring on the military front is very important. As you've said, Belarus is right next to NATO country Poland. Russia has also raised questions about a threat to its territory from Poland and from Lithuania. Because of the exclave of Russian territory, Kaliningrad, the former Königsberg, which Russia took as territory on the Baltic Sea during World War II. That, of course, borders Lithuania and Poland. And Belarus is the main supply corridor for Kaliningrad as a sort of a military base from Russian territory as well as from the Baltic Sea. So this is a very tense situation there. There's lots of saber rattling going on there. We have to take this 100% seriously. Clearly also on cyber, we see that Anne Neuberger is going out to deal with the cyber front. And we really have to work very hard, as Ambassador Taylor said, in making the threats of sanctions very credible along with our allies. I think this major point of how do we deal with Hungary and some of our other allies that may be trying to choose a bilateral route is going to be rather complicated because Putin clearly, in making this bid for each individual OSCE member to write in their answer on a postcard about how they see indivisible security, is trying to pick countries off. So I think trying to maintain unity is pretty critical. And I really like Congressman Wilson what you said too about the unity here in the House and in the Senate. I don't think, honestly, that Putin did expect that, given some of our polarization and partisan infighting on many other topics. I think we've surprised them, and I think we need to keep on doing that.
Congressman Moore, I would agree that President Putin is probably surprised at the unity, not just in the United States, and not just in Ukraine, but also in Europe. I think he's probably surprised that his saber rattling, his movement of all these troops to the borders of Ukraine. He's probably surprised that President Zelensky has not caved or has not been intimidated. He's probably surprised that the United States hasn't been intimidated. This is a strong showing by the United States, by Ukraine, together with the Europeans. We have to remember the Europeans have reauthorized sanctions every 6 months for the last 8 years since the Russians invaded, and I'm sure President Putin was surprised by that. So if he's thinking that we're bluffing, that's a mistake. There is the question just raised, and that is he bluffing? And we can't assume he's bluffing because he's invaded before. He surprised us before. He invaded Ukraine in 2014. But what we can say is he's been looking at the unity. He's been looking at the possibility of severe sanctions. He's been looking at the additional reinforcements that the United States is already sending into East Europe. He didn't expect that.
Like my colleagues here, I'm very deeply concerned by Russia's increasingly belligerent behavior and large-scale military buildup on the Ukrainian border. I saw this right firsthand. Just as Mr. Wilson had said earlier, we went to a Kovel in Ukraine as part of my subcommittee chairmanship on the Armed Services Committee. And we know that Russia is directly threatening the sovereignty of Ukraine and the democracy by its people and the stability and security that Europe has enjoyed since the end of the Cold War, all to rewrite European security. We cannot forget that, most importantly, that this crisis is one that Russia itself has manufactured, all for its own gain. We must continue to strengthen deterrence, and we must do so in coordination with our allies and our partners. My first question is for Dr. Hill. Thank you for your testimony and for your long-standing courage to speak truth to power. I appreciate the detail in which you outlined Russian thinking in your written testimony, including the advantages that Kremlin perceives vis-a-vis the United States and the West. I wanted to ask you to describe the flip side of it. What do you see as Russia's greatest vulnerabilities? And both where, and with Nord Stream 2 as an example, how do you think we can do a better job of exploiting Russian weaknesses with our allies and partners?
I think the biggest vulnerabilities are with time for Russia. So I think this is one of the reasons why Putin is acting now. A vulnerability always comes in Russia and in other places too when you have a presidential election. And we had a question before from Congressman Cohen about Putin's popularity and whether this really matters, and that in fact does. So one vulnerability really is in the legitimacy of the system, because Putin in 2020 basically pushed through this amendment to extend his presidential terms, and there were some questions about really the validity of that, even from the Russian constitutional perspective. And all eyes are really on him and his inner circle as to whether they can carry off a smooth transition into the next phase of his presidency, or if he in fact has a successor that he wants to put in place. And if we've seen what happened in Kazakhstan, where President Nazarbayev handed off to President Tokayev, and we've just seen what looks like some really nasty protests in response to socioeconomic problems there, but also a power struggle behind the scenes, which often happens when you change over. And so I think that Putin and the people around him are a little bit worried about their version of 2024 and what might happen. And also, you mentioned energy. Time is on Russia's side right now for energy, because Russia has, very effectively continued to dominate the gas sector in a number of critical European countries, including Germany and most notably Hungary. Viktor Orban being in Moscow to essentially sign a massive gas deal for cheaper gas, which Russia also hopes will give political influence. And of course, that's why we've all been concerned about Nord Stream 2. But over time, Russia knows that its dominance in the European energy sector will change. The Europeans haven't done a great job of gas storage because of the COVID pandemic, not really sure how the economy would bounce back. It's a cold winter. They're worried about gas shortages and other energy shortages, and Russia hopes that, of course, that will mean that there will be much reluctance to put sanctions on the energy sector, and there'll be a lot of pressure from the European energy companies and consumers and governments against sanctions. So that is a vulnerability over the longer term. The more that we can push for diversification of the European energy sector, and successive US administrations have done just that, the more that we can also, stick true to our own democracy and, our own free and fair elections. I mean, that will also be signaling. I mean, the Russians, unfortunately, tend to kind of point to weaknesses elsewhere as an excuse for their own, messing about in their domestic politics. But there is a vulnerability ahead for Putin and in his re-election and pushing forward. Obviously, that's why Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition figure, is sitting in jail, because Putin's clearly frightened of him and the challenge that he poses. And ultimately, just like Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus, Putin's worried about the Russian people and their own feelings about how a war might play out, their own socioeconomic concerns. This could be a distraction from the pandemic. Russia hasn't fared very well with COVID. Like many other countries, the government hasn't really handled it. They have actually had a backlash to their own propaganda against vaccinations. The Sputnik vaccine, although it's been effective, has not been as effective as the vaccines that have been produced here and in Europe. And the propaganda that the Russians perpetrators come back to bite them. They have very low vaccine rates in Russia. So there's all kinds of things there. Climate change is also a major problem for Russia looking ahead as well. So this is why Putin's trying to act now. But I think those vulnerabilities are things that we can press on later, but with the aim, of course, of trying to engage Russia. I mean, we should want to see a better relationship over time with Russia. I think there are also vulnerabilities, and I hope Lieutenant General Hodges is still on here to talk to this, in the Russian military as well. Russia makes a big show of its novel nuclear weapons, its strategic nuclear arsenal, because Russia does feel very vulnerable against our conventional forces. And I think a lot of this posturing, Russia is, of course, strong when you look at it from the point of view of the Ukrainian military, but when you look at the full array of NATO forces, Russia is still at a major disadvantage on the conventional front. And so I think that is part of an element of this as well.
Well, in General Hodges, we could talk a little bit about that, but I also want to ask you what you describe in your written testimony as the Russian way of war. Russia has been relying on gray zone techniques to exert influence, whether that's launching cyber campaigns or spreading disinformation. How would you assess the U.S. response to these Russian activities? And are there certain steps that we should take in order to be more effective operating potentially and fighting in the gray zone?
But two things that that are real vulnerabilities. They don't have any friends. I mean, they may have Prime Minister Orban, of course, will come a little bit, but they don't have allies. We've got 29 allies plus real partners with real capability, all focused on this threat. That is the main vulnerability that we should be exploiting to isolate them and make sure we don't lose that advantage. And then down inside their formation, even though they have done a lot to modernize, it still is about 50% a conscript army, which means that you've got a wide range of capabilities. And we can get caught up in, they have 75 or 80 of these BTGs, the battalion tactical groups, but these are not like a battalion from the 101st Airborne Division or a Marine battalion. This is a different kind of capability, so we should not be overwhelmed by that. In terms of the Russian way of war, we continue to be surprised by what they do, because we just can't imagine that in the year 2022 that a European leader would do the things that they do. The murder, the targeted assassinations, the use of cyber, not only to interfere with our elections and cause us to lose trust in our institutions, but also to ruin people's lives, smashing their financial institutions and so on. So when we get into a war mindset, that doesn't mean kinetic, but we have to be in the same frame of mind that they are, or at least recognize that they are in a war footing all the time, whether it's disinformation or nuclear weapons and everything in between. Then we can take advantage of all of our assets and dominate them.
This is just for Ambassador Terry. I want to ask you about your recent trip to Ukraine. Is there something that you have from takeaways from you there that we could be doing to make them, more lethal and create, at least some deterrence in the minds of Russia?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, General Hodges and I heard President Zelensky answer that question. And he said he wanted to increase the size of his military. He wants to be able to have a larger military, and he wants to double their pay. And to do both of those functions, to do those tasks, he needs funds. He needs money. He needs financial support. He's got the intent, the determination, and the military. You saw it as well, and I'm very glad that you were there last month. You saw it as well. They are determined. They are overmatched. The Ukrainians are overmatched by the Russians, and President Zelensky wants to begin to address that by hiring and recruiting more soldiers for him, and he wants to pay them better. So that's the one thing. That's one new thing that we do.
Excellent. Thank you. Now you're back.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, very briefly, Congressman Gallego is being very modest. On our visit, he was so effective in expressing support for the people of Ukraine that a member of the Russian Duma on Russian television announced that he should be kidnapped and brought to Moscow for trial. What a backhanded compliment.
Thank you. Thank you, President Wilson.
Joining a distinguished list of U.S. congressmen and senators who have been put on that list. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Taylor, in your opening comments, you were talking about how you thought that the threat of an imminent invasion maybe is reduced and that there's an interest in negotiation. I'm trying to understand why on earth we would accept any. I mean, they've laid a predicate through a very provocative posture. And now they're saying if we behave or agree to something differently, what is the rational basis for us getting into kind of a hostage-like negotiation discussion with them? It just doesn't seem like it's a good faith discussion. So why am I wrong?
So you're absolutely right. While Russia has all those troops on the border, it is a threat to Ukraine. It's holding a gun to Ukraine's head, the hostage, while they negotiate on these other issues. So in order to have any kind of legitimate conversation, productive conversation, they have to demobilize. They have to send their troops, forces back to barracks, back to their home stations. So that's number one. Number two, if the threat of their invasion has gone down, and I think it probably has to some degree. I mean, we see less of the imminent rhetoric that if you don't answer right away, we're going to use military technical means to get you to answer. That's gone. They're now talking about, first of all, they're saying, well, we never intended to invade, which we, of course, don't believe, but that's what they would have us believe. But they also now say that they're willing to have this negotiation. And again, as long as the gun goes down from Ukraine's head, we can have this negotiation. And there are at least two areas that would make sense to negotiate from our standpoint, from NATO's standpoint. And they are military exercises. If we had visibility into their exercise, they say that all these troops on the border of Ukraine and up into Belarus, they're there for exercises. Well, if we had some notice of that exercise, that would be more credible. Totally incredible at this point, but that is an area where we could benefit. That is, if they were to give us notice of their exercises and invite our people to observe them, in return NATO would tell them when we're going to have exercises and invite Russian officers to observe our exercises. That would be an increase in stability and security for both sides. The second area is on intermediate range nuclear weapons, which, again, those conversations had already started. We'd be happy to have that conversation. So those are areas, again, if the gun goes down from the Ukrainians' head.
Thank you for that. General Hodges, I actually agree with the decision to deploy some of our 82nd Airborne to Poland and Germany. Do you all believe that increased troop posture is wise in the current conditions?
Sir, I absolutely do. Number one, it demonstrates will and resolve when we take our highest readiness forces and send them over to Europe for an undetermined amount of time. That demonstrates that we're serious about this, because obviously this is not cheap. And then, of course, this is prudent. You don't want to wait till a crisis to then decide you need to have more troops over there. So I think this was a prudent move by the department to get capability that's much closer. We can be sure if there is a no-kidding fight, we will not have uncontested passage of the Atlantic or flying in there either, whether it's kinetic or cyber. So I was really happy to see this.
I think, the administration and others have tried to explain this very well, but as you said, the broader public is probably scratching their head and thinking, hang on, what's going on here? Why are we saying, the United States, that this is imminent, and the British are saying the same, and the guy who's sitting right there on the border is saying, no need to panic, nothing happening. In part, there's obviously is that real concern about panic and people actually already crossing Ukraine's borders into other countries in anticipation of a conflict, because we've already seen, of course, what happens when Russia invades in Donbass, and there have been many people displaced. Tens of thousands of people have left the Donbass region for Ukraine itself. Some have gone into Russia. So Ukraine already has a problem with internally displaced people and refugees. The other point is, of course, the economy. And in fact, when we think about what Putin might have already got out of this massive movement of troops, it might be exactly this, which is ruining Ukraine's current chances of turning around its economy. Ukraine was on the verge of really getting its macroeconomic situation stabilized. I mean, we've all been worrying about this for some considerable period of time, finding a new arrangement with the International Monetary Fund, starting to get investment. It really looked as if Ukraine was getting its act together economically. And just as that moment starts to appear, you still then see the looming forces on the border. And I don't think that is also coincidental. I think that Russia was starting to worry that actually Ukraine was looking a bit more successful than it had been previously. There's a lot of infighting going on with Ukrainian oligarchs and business people, kind of in and around Zelensky and the former presidents in Ukraine. But nonetheless, Ukraine was looking more promising as a place for international investment. And so I think Zelensky is very mindful of that right now. I mean, a run on the currency, the crash of the economy, investors not just putting things on pause, but pulling out entirely, and that could be one serious win for the Russians. If nothing else happens, that they've scared everyone away from investing in Ukraine, because of course Moscow's been trying to point to Ukraine as a basket case, as not worthy of investment, and basically that Ukraine is not going to succeed. So I think that that's actually a large part of it. And as you said, we're going to have to try to thread the needle on that one. How can we kind of reassure the markets that Ukraine is a long-term good investment, at the same time as we're trying to warn everybody that they're at risk of imminent invasion from Russia? And
we asked President Zelensky about this apparent difference in the perception. He's very clear. He understands very well what the forces are. He gets almost the same briefing from his intelligence agencies as President Biden does. President Zelensky wants to present a firm posture, a firm face, a firm stance as he faces down President Putin. And he and President Biden have held firm. They've not been rattled. They've not been intimidated. And they've been together on this. And President Zelensky in particular wants to demonstrate calm, determination, and he's very pleased with the results of all of the NATO allies who are providing him with weapons. And as you said, there's an important role to be played on demonstrating the concern in order to get other allies to provide those weapons. That's succeeding. In particular, in the last week, that's been succeeding. So President Zelensky wants to project calm, concern. He's got his military very focused on this issue, there's no doubt, and he wants to enlarge them. He wants to grow that military, as he just indicated. So that's his direction at this point.
From the conversations that have taken place as recently as this week, there appears to be solid commitment by Germany to NATO's mission, as well as unity on additional sanctions against Russia for further incursions. So I'm pleased to see the unity that we have, and I think that message has not been lost on Mr. Putin.
Can you imagine that Mr. Putin has brought Republicans and Democrats together in such a warm way? But another country affected that needs to be appreciated is Turkey, with the Crimea, with the Russian occupation of portions of Georgia on both sides in the Black Sea. Our great ally of Turkey, which has significant influence in Central Asia, is being affected, and we just appreciate so much our 70-year alliance of NATO with Turkey. Thank you.
Right. And as we pointed out, if you look at those that are on the list that Russia has interest to make sure we are not invited to their country, you'll find there are equal number of Democrats and Republicans. So we're together in that effort. Congressman Cohen?
I just want to say one last thing, and I presume Mr. Putin might watch this or hear about it. I want to make a direct appeal to Mr. Putin. Please, pour yourself a vodka, get a Blenny, have some caviar, enjoy the Winter Olympics, get your thrills vicariously, watch your athletes perform. Hopefully they'll win some gold medals. I'm sure they will. They're great athletes. Russia has great athletes and great...
That's a nice final comment. General Hodges, anything further that you want to...
We have got to get ambassadors in post.
Yes.
It makes it so difficult for our country to carry out our foreign policy when we don't have our diplomats in post. And I mean, I'm not naive, I understand the process, but we are paying a price right now by not having all of our posts filled. So thank you for your support there.
I absolutely agree. And there is a lot of fault to go by. The Biden administration was not that fast in naming ambassadors and still has not named ambassadors in some key positions. And there's been individual senators, Republican senators, who have put holds on just about every nomination, which means that we have to go through a lengthy process on confirmation, which is totally uncalled for.